There's a moment that happens inside every avoidant after they've lost someone extraordinary. Not a gradual dawning, not a slow realization that builds over weeks, a specific, undeniable, crashing moment where the defenses fail and reality breaks through completely, where they finally see you as you actually are, as you always were, without the distortion of their fear, filtering everything you did into threat. And what they see in that moment destroys them, because what they see is that you are the best thing in their life, that you are offering exactly what their wounded self needed, that you are rare in ways they were too defended to honor while they had you. They realize, with a completeness that's almost physical, that you were too valuable to lose. And they realize this at the exact moment when you're already gone. That's the cruelest irony in avoidant psychology. The timing, the devastating gap between when they finally understand your value and when that understanding could have actually changed anything. They see you clearly now. The defensive filter is down. The fear that made your love feel like pressure, that made your presence feel like suffocation, that reframed your completely normal needs as excessive demands, all of it has collapsed under the weight of your absence. And what remains, once the defenses fall, is accurate perception of someone extraordinary that they treated like a problem. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. Before you let their realization mean something, it doesn't mean. Recognition is not transformation. Seeing your value after losing you is not the same as having developed the capacity to honor your value while keeping you. And confusing those two things, letting their belated clarity pull you back towards someone who still hasn't done the work, is the specific mistake this video is going to protect you from making. Stay with me, because understanding exactly what's happening inside them, why it's happening now instead of before, and what it actually means for you, this is going to change how you see everything. Why their defenses fail after you leave and not before. The timing isn't bad luck. It is an unfortunate coincidence that they're finally seeing clearly at the exact moment when clarity can't save the relationship. The timing is built into the psychology. Avoidants cannot fully see what they have while they have it, and understanding why reveals something essential about the entire dynamic. Here's the mechanism. Seeing what they have requires acknowledging how much losing it would hurt. And acknowledging potential hurt is precisely what the avoidant's entire defensive system exists to prevent. Their defenses aren't random. They're not character flaws in the simple sense. They're a nervous system that learned, usually in childhood, that emotional dependence leads to pain, that needing someone means becoming vulnerable to loss, that the safest way to manage attachment is to minimize it, to maintain distance, to never fully acknowledge how much someone matters, because acknowledging it creates the unbearable possibility of losing it. So while they were with you, their defensive system was actively working against their ability to see your value. Every time they started to recognize how important you were, the recognition triggered anxiety, because importance means vulnerability, and vulnerability means potential devastation. The defense responded automatically. Minimize the attachment, withdraw from the closeness, reframe your value as ordinary, so losing you wouldn't feel catastrophic. They weren't consciously doing this. Their nervous system was doing it without their permission, protecting them from the exact awareness that would have protected the relationship. Then you left. And here's what their defensive system couldn't account for. The loss it was trying to prevent happened anyway. The catastrophe it was avoiding arrived regardless. And once the loss is complete, once you're actually gone and the relationship is actually over, there's nothing left for the defenses to protect. The thing they were guarding against has already occurred. So the defenses relax, and reality, finally unobstructed, floods in. They see you now, because losing you removed the reason their defenses were hiding you from them. They had to lose you to see you. That's not poetic. That's the actual mechanism, and it means their clarity arrived exactly on schedule. The schedule of avoidant psychology, not the schedule that would have served you or the relationship. The specific realizations hitting them right now. It doesn't arrive as one insight. It cascades. One recognition triggers another and another until the full weight of what they lost becomes something they can't minimize or reframe or escape. It starts with absence doing what presence couldn't. The first weeks after separation might actually feel like relief to them. And this is important to understand because it can be confusing if you know about it. They have the space they always claimed to need. The pressure they described is gone. And for a moment, their nervous system settles into the relief of no longer managing the anxiety that intimacy creates in them. Their narrative feels confirmed. Space was what they needed. But relief is only relief when you're removing something that was causing discomfort. Once the discomfort is gone, what remains isn't peace, it's absence. And absence has a texture. It's specific. They start noticing not just that you're gone, but what's gone with you. You were the person who asked how their day went and actually wanted to know. You were the one who remembered the small things, the meeting they were nervous about, the conversation they were dreading, the hope they mentioned once in passing. You were the stable presence that made their defended independence feel like chosen freedom rather than enforced isolation. These specific absences accumulate. Each one is small. Together, they're devastating. And the accumulation is teaching them something they couldn't learn while you were present, that what you provided wasn't generic relationship benefits. It was specific, irreplaceable, uniquely yours. Then comparison arrives and does what description never could. They encounter other people. Maybe they date. Maybe they attempt new connections. Maybe they simply interact with people who might have been relationship candidates in another life. And every interaction provides data. This person is less patient. That one requires more explanation to understand what they mean. Another one offers sympathy without the specific understanding you had of them. The conversations are more effortful. The connection is more conditional. The acceptance is narrower. And through every comparison, you're becoming more defined, not as idealized memory, but as clear assessment of actual rarity. They're not missing the fantasy of you. They're recognizing through direct experience what you actually were, because experiencing what you're not reveals, with devastating precision, what you were. The crisis moment lands differently than anything else. There comes a moment when they experience something difficult, a professional setback, a family situation, a health concern, a decision they can't navigate alone. And their instinctive response is to reach for you, to tell you what's happening, to get your specific perspective, your particular wisdom, your grounded understanding of them and their situation. But you're not there, and nothing else fills that space adequately. Generic support is available. Sympathy is available. Advice from people who don't know them deeply is available. But what you provided, support that was calibrated to who they actually are, perspective that emerged from genuinely knowing them, that's not available. That's gone. And the gap is felt most precisely in the moments when it matters most. And then, if they see you living well, if they see you building and flourishing and moving forward, something breaks open completely. Because it's one thing to know you're gone. It's another to see that you're fine, that the person they thought might crumble without them is standing fully, moving forward, possibly giving to someone else what they couldn't receive from you. The jealousy that arises isn't just about loss. It's about recognition. Someone else is receiving what they rejected. Someone else was capable of seeing your value in real time. Someone else didn't need to lose you to understand what you were. And that recognition, that their failure was a choice, not an inevitability, because someone else is succeeding where they failed, is what finally makes the realization complete and devastating. What they're understanding about you that they couldn't see before. The recognition isn't abstract, it's specific, and understanding what they're finally seeing helps you trust your own perception of what you brought to this relationship. Because their belated clarity confirms what you always knew about yourself and what you were offering. They're understanding that you loved them through their defenses in a way that almost no one does. Most people encounter avoidant patterns and respond predictably. They leave early. They retaliate with coldness. They become defended themselves. They demand change and withdraw when it doesn't come. You didn't. You stayed open when they were closed. You continued showing up when they were withdrawing. You maintained your care when they were cold. This wasn't codependency. It wasn't lack of self-respect. It was extraordinary emotional capacity. The ability to see someone's wounded self beneath their defended behavior and love toward that person without losing yourself in the process. They're recognizing now that this combination, empathy sophisticated enough to see beneath patterns, strength sufficient to remain present despite them, is genuinely rare. Most people can't do it. Most people protect themselves by leaving. You had both the capacity and the willingness, and they took it so completely for granted that they experienced it as ordinary until it was gone. They're recognizing that you were offering a secure base they actively refused. You were offering them safety, a relationship where they could pursue their individual needs and growth while having your genuine support and acceptance to return to. This is what healthy partnership provides. Mutual foundation where both people can expand individually because the connection between them is secure. But they experienced your offer as threat. Your acceptance felt like pressure. Your consistency felt like suffocation. Their wounds reframed the safest thing available to them as the most dangerous. They rejected the exact foundation that would have allowed them to become a fuller version of themselves. And they're finally understanding this, that what they experienced as you being too much was actually you offering them what their wounded self most needed, and their defended self couldn't receive what their real self desperately wanted. They're seeing that your empathy, which they may have reframed as weakness during the relationship, was actually sophisticated strength. Feeling things deeply is not weakness. Understanding someone's wounds is not codependency. Staying present for a defended person requires more emotional strength than almost anything else in human experience, because you're giving without equivalent return, remaining open while receiving coldness, continuing to choose someone who keeps choosing their defenses over you. That's not the behavior of someone who lacks self-respect. That's the behavior of someone with profound capacity for love, combined with enough self-knowledge to understand that another person's wounds are not personal rejection. They reframe this as your weakness because recognizing it as your strength would have required them to acknowledge how much they were receiving without reciprocating. Now, without the defensive reframing, they see it clearly. You were extraordinary, and they treated you like you were the problem. And perhaps most painfully, their understanding that you weren't asking them to change who they fundamentally were. You were asking them to address the wounds, preventing them from being who they actually wanted to be. They experienced your requests as pressure to become a different person. But what you were actually asking for, more presence, more consistency, basic emotional reciprocity, wasn't a personality transplant. It was healing. It was the therapeutic work that would have served them in every area of their life, not just in the relationship with you. They were protecting a wounded, defended, limited version of themselves and calling it authenticity. You are asking them to become healthier. They're finally seeing the difference. And the seeing is devastating because it reveals they were their own obstacle. They were the thing standing between themselves and the life they actually wanted. Why their recognition doesn't mean what part of you wants it to mean. This is where the video gets difficult, because there's a part of you, the part that loved them, the part that spent months or years hoping they would finally see you clearly, that wants their recognition to mean something it doesn't mean, that wants their realization to be the breakthrough that changes the equation. So let's be precise about what their recognition actually is and isn't. Recognition is cognitive, capacity is neurological. They are not the same thing, and one does not automatically produce the other. The avoidant now understands, intellectually and emotionally, that you were too valuable to lose. They can articulate what you were. They can describe what made you rare. They can explain, in moving and specific language, exactly how they failed you and why losing you was a catastrophic mistake. None of that requires having changed. All of that requires only having reflected while experiencing painful consequences. Avoidants are often highly intelligent, emotionally perceptive people who understand their patterns with remarkable clarity on a cognitive level. They can see what they do and why they do it. The problem was never that they lacked understanding. The problem was that their nervous system responded to intimacy with threat responses that their intellectual understanding couldn't override. And intellectual understanding of your value doesn't change that. Only sustained therapeutic work, the kind that literally rewires nervous system responses over months and years of consistent effort, changes that. Their recognition tells you they've been thinking deeply about what they lost. It tells you nothing about whether they've developed different capacity. There's also a motivation problem worth examining directly. Why is the recognition arriving now? Partially because your absence has made your value visible in ways your presence obscured, but also, and this matters, because recognizing your value serves them. It provides explanation for their pain. It creates hope that getting you back could end the suffering they're experiencing. The recognition and any reach out that follows is happening at the moment when it would benefit them for you to know about it. That's not cynical, it's accurate. Their recognition is partially genuine insight and partially pain management, and returning would primarily relieve their discomfort while potentially restarting yours. Here is the standard that protects you. You deserve someone who recognized your value while they had you, someone who honored it through consistent behavior while the relationship was active, someone who didn't need to lose you to understand what you were worth. The avoidant is finally seeing your value. Someone else will see it immediately. Someone else won't require the education of losing you to understand what they have. That person exists. That person has the capacity the avoidant lacks. Not intelligence, not emotional depth, but the nervous system regulation and the attachment security to recognize and honor extraordinary value in real time, rather than only in retrospect. What their realization is actually doing to you right now. Let's talk about what happens inside you when you find out they've realized your value. Because it's not simple, and pretending it's simple does you a disservice. The first thing it does is vindicate you, and that vindication is real, and you should let it land fully. Throughout the relationship and after it ended, you likely questioned your perception. Maybe you overestimated what you were offering. Maybe your needs were as excessive as their framing suggested. Maybe you were the problem and their withdrawal was justified. Their recognition demolishes every version of that self-doubt conclusively. You weren't wrong about the relationship's potential. The potential was real. They simply lacked the capacity to fulfill it. You weren't wrong about your own value. You were exactly as valuable as you believed. They just couldn't see it through their defenses. You weren't the problem. Their patterns were the problem. Their wounds were the obstacle. Their incapacity was what prevented what you were building from becoming what it could have been. Let the vindication be complete. You were right about yourself the entire time. But underneath the vindication, if you're honest, is grief. Not new grief, the grief that was already there, that you've been working through, but grief that gets activated again when their recognition arrives, because they're finally seeing you clearly, is also confirmation of the specific tragedy at the center of this story. They could see you. The capacity for accurate perception was always there. It just required losing you to activate it, which means the relationship didn't fail because they were fundamentally incapable of seeing you. It failed because their wounds made seeing you while keeping you impossible. And that's a more painful truth than simple incapacity, because it contains the ghost of what could have been if things had been different. Let yourself feel that. Don't rush past it. The grief is appropriate. The relationship was genuinely significant. What you offered was genuinely extraordinary. And the loss of something extraordinary deserves to be grieved completely, not managed into intellectual distance. What you don't have to do is let the grief become an opening for them. Grief is appropriate. Reunion driven by grief, by the activation of hope that their recognition creates, by the fantasy of finally being seen by someone who now sees you. That's a different thing entirely. Grief is honoring what was real, returning because their recognition makes you hope they've changed, is conflating being seen with being safe. They can see you fully now and still be incapable of loving you safely. Those are separate things. The question of your own forward movement. Their realization changes nothing about your forward movement. I want to say that plainly before we discuss what it does change, because the nothing is important. It doesn't change the validity of your decision to leave or create distance. You left, or you're holding distance, for reasons that were valid then and remain valid now. Their patterns made healthy relationship impossible. Their emotional unavailability prevented genuine partnership. Their inability to meet basic relationship needs made staying untenable for your well-being. Their recognition that you were too valuable to lose doesn't undo any of those reasons. The past behavior still happened. The pattern still existed through the duration of the relationship. The harm was real and had real effects on your confidence, your peace, your sense of self. None of that is revised by their belated accuracy about your value. It doesn't obligate you to give them the opportunity to prove they've changed. You are not required to become the testing ground for their potential growth. You are not obligated to offer yourself as the relationship in which they demonstrate new capacity. If they've genuinely done therapeutic work, if they've been consistently engaged with an attachment-informed therapist for a year or more, if they can speak specifically about what they've learned and what's different in their nervous system responses, if they've demonstrated changed patterns through sustained behavior rather than through apology, then a cautious, boundaried conversation is something you could choose. But you could choose it. You're not obligated to it. Their suffering from recognizing what they lost is their burden to carry. It is not your responsibility to relieve it. What their recognition does change is the story you tell yourself about what happened. And this matters more than it might initially seem. The narrative you carry about this relationship shapes how you enter future ones, what you believe about your own value, what you expect from partners, what you're willing to tolerate, and what you require. Their recognition rewrites a key part of that narrative. It removes the version where maybe you were too much, maybe you asked for too much, maybe you drove someone away with your needs. It replaces that version with the accurate one. You were extraordinary. You offered something rare. The relationship failed because of incapacity on their side, not insufficiency on yours. Carry that narrative forward. Build your next relationship on the foundation of that accurate self-understanding. Require partners whose capacity matches your value, not because you're demanding or difficult, but because you now have confirmation from someone who saw your value after losing it, that your value is real and significant and worth honoring in real time. What thriving looks like from here. The most powerful response to their realization that you were too valuable to lose is becoming undeniably, visibly, genuinely someone who could not be lost without catastrophic consequence, and then giving that version of yourself to someone capable of recognizing it while holding it. This isn't about performance. It's not about making sure they see you flourishing so they feel the full weight of their mistake, though that may be a side effect. It's about actually building the life that was being compressed by a relationship that required more from you than it returned. When you're in a relationship with someone emotionally unavailable, you unconsciously contract. You manage your needs. You dampen your expression. You pour enormous energy into a connection that can't fully receive it, which means that energy isn't available for the rest of your life. When that relationship ends, the energy returns. And the question is, what you do with it. Build with it. Return to the things you let diminish while you were pouring yourself into someone who couldn't hold what you were offering. Invest in friendships that are genuinely reciprocal, where the care flows both directions without you having to manage the imbalance. Pursue the goals that got backgrounded while the relationship consumed your emotional bandwidth. Develop the parts of yourself that were waiting for space to grow. Not as therapy for heartbreak, though they'll serve that purpose too, but because you're someone with extraordinary capacity, and that capacity deserves to be expressed in a life that can actually receive it. The relationship that's coming, when you're ready, when the grief has run its course, and you've rebuilt enough to be genuinely available, will be different from what you've been experiencing. Not because you'll have lowered your standards, because you'll be clearer about what you require. You won't accept early signs of emotional unavailability as things you can love someone through. You'll recognize the patterns faster and trust your recognition. You'll know, with the confidence that comes from having survived this, that you can leave when something isn't working, and that leaving doesn't mean failure. It means self-respect. And someone will meet you in that place, someone whose nervous system is regulated enough that your love feels like love rather than like threat. Someone who can receive what you're offering without their defenses converting it into pressure. Someone who sees your value while you're present, in the ordinary Tuesday moments, in the small, consistent ways that real love actually operates, in the daily choices to show up rather than withdraw. Someone who won't need to lose you to understand what they have. The permanent truth about their realization. They realize you're too valuable to lose. That realization is accurate. It's probably the clearest they've ever seen you, and it changes nothing about what you owe them, nothing about whether you should return, nothing about the forward trajectory of your life. What it confirms is this: you are always too valuable to lose, not because their recognition makes it true, but because it was true the entire time, and their recognition is simply evidence of a truth that existed independent of their ability to see it. Your value didn't depend on their perception. You were extraordinary when they were treating you like ordinary. You were too valuable to lose when they were doing exactly that, losing you through patterns they refuse to address. Their realization is their education, the painful, costly, consequence-delivered education that avoidant patterns produce when they're allowed to run their full course without intervention. Let them receive that education. Let it teach them what nothing else could teach. Let it motivate whatever growth they might be capable of, which may eventually benefit someone they meet in a future chapter when they've done the work that their realization now reveals was always necessary. But you are not the curriculum. You are not the relationship in which they prove they've learned. You are not required to make yourself available for someone to demonstrate growth at your expense after demonstrating harm at your expense for the duration of what you were building together. You were too valuable to lose. You are too valuable to wait. You are too valuable to give another chapter to someone whose clearest vision of you arrived only after they'd already lost you. Someone will see your value in real time. Someone will honor it through consistent, unglamorous, daily behavior, rather than through belated recognition delivered after the damage is done. Someone will choose you, actively, repeatedly, without requiring the threat of loss to remind them what they have. That person exists. Make room for them, and in the meantime, become more fully, more unapologetically, more completely yourself, because you were always too valuable to lose. And now, it's time to live like you know it. And I want to sit with that last sentence for a moment, because live like you know it is easy to say and genuinely difficult to do. Knowing your value intellectually and actually operating from that knowledge in your daily life, in your choices, in how you show up in new connections, those are separated by a gap that most people don't talk about honestly. So let's talk about it. Because the avoidance realization about your value is only useful to you if it completes something inside you rather than just confirming something about them. The gap between knowing your value and living from it. Here's what actually happens to most people after a relationship with someone emotionally unavailable. They carry a split. On one level, they know intellectually that they weren't the problem, that their needs were legitimate, that their value was real. They can say the words. They can articulate the logic. They can explain to a friend, clearly and accurately, exactly why the relationship failed and why the failure wasn't their fault. But on another level, a deeper, quieter, more persistent level, there's a wound that the intellectual understanding doesn't reach. A place that still wonders, still asks the old questions in the middle of the night when the rational mind is less available. Was I actually too much? Did I ask for too much? Is there something about the way I love that makes people need to escape? These questions don't respond to logic. You can't think your way out of them because they weren't created by thought. They were created by experience. By the repeated experience of loving someone who kept choosing distance over closeness, defense over vulnerability, withdrawal over presence. Experiences that repeated often enough write themselves into the body, into the nervous system, into the automatic responses that operate below conscious decision-making. And the wound from that kind of repeated experience requires more than accurate information to heal. It requires new experience, different experience. The lived, felt, embodied experience of being loved in ways that contradict what the wound believes about you. This is why the healing isn't primarily cognitive. Reading the right things, understanding the psychology, achieving intellectual clarity about what happened. These are valuable and they're part of the process. But they're the beginning of healing, not the end of it. The end of it looks like being in a moment of genuine connection with someone who is consistently present and noticing that your nervous system doesn't brace for withdrawal, that you don't monitor their behavior for early signs of the pattern you learn to anticipate, that you can receive their care without the part of you that learned to distrust care, automatically scanning for evidence that it will be taken away. That embodied relaxation, that is what healed looks like. And you don't get there through understanding alone. You get there through time, through continued self-work, and eventually through the experience of being loved safely. So if you're not there yet, if you still find yourself bracing, still find the old questions surfacing at inconvenient moments, that's not evidence that you haven't healed enough or haven't understood enough. That's evidence that you're human and that real healing moves at the pace of nervous systems, not at the pace of intellectual comprehension. Be patient with yourself in a way you probably weren't allowed to expect patience from them. What you're allowed to feel about their realization. There's a conversation about this that needs to happen because most people feel complicated, sometimes contradictory things when they learn that an avoidant has finally realized their value, and those feelings deserve acknowledgement rather than management. You're allowed to feel satisfied, not in a small or guilty way, in a complete, clear-eyed way. The person who made you question your value, who made you wonder if your needs were reasonable, who withdrew when you needed presence and made you responsible for their emotional regulation while neglecting yours, that person is now sitting with the full weight of what their patterns cost them. There's something that is simply true about that being appropriate. Consequences for behavior are appropriate. The avoidant experiencing the pain of losing someone extraordinary is not something you need to feel guilty about feeling satisfied by. You didn't cause their pain through cruelty. You caused it through finally choosing yourself. Those are different things entirely. You're also allowed to feel sad for them. These two things coexist without contradiction. The avoidance patterns aren't chosen in the way conscious cruelty is chosen. They emerge from wounds, usually early wounds, wounds that arrive before the person had any capacity to protect themselves from or process what was happening to them. The defended, withdrawing, emotionally unavailable person you loved was shaped by experiences that shaped them before they were old enough to consent to being shaped. Their patterns hurt you. That's real. And the person underneath those patterns suffered in ways that created them. That's also real. You can hold both truths without one canceling the other. Compassion for their wounds doesn't mean excusing their behavior. It means you're capable of the kind of nuanced understanding that makes you extraordinary, which is exactly what their belated realization confirmed. You're allowed to feel the specific grief of the almost, not just the grief of losing the relationship, but the grief of how close it came to being what it could have been. They could see you all along. The capacity for accurate perception was always there. It just required the removal of you to activate. And there's something particularly painful about that. Not the grief of two incompatible people who were never going to work. The grief of two people who could have worked, where one person's wounds prevented the working and the wounds were addressable, and they just didn't address them in time. The grief of the almost is different from the grief of the impossible. Let yourself feel its specific shape without trying to convert it into something more manageable. And you're allowed, this one is important, to feel ready. Not performed readiness, not declared readiness before it's arrived, but the actual felt sense of having moved through enough of the grief that forward feels more real than backward. Some people reading this are still in the early stages where forward is something they believe in conceptually but can't yet feel. Some people are somewhere in the middle, where forward and backward are in genuine contest. And some people are genuinely ready. The grief has run enough of its course that new possibility feels real rather than theoretical. Wherever you are in that spectrum is exactly where you should be. But if you're feeling ready, let yourself feel it without guilt. Moving forward is not betrayal of what you had. It's not evidence that it didn't matter. It's what the person who was always too valuable to lose does with the rest of their extraordinary life. The relationship that's actually coming. Let's talk concretely about what you're moving toward, because abstract reassurances about future love are easy to dismiss when you're in the specific texture of this particular pain. So I want to be specific, The relationship that's coming will feel different from the beginning in ways that will be disorienting at first. Because you've calibrated to a particular emotional environment, one where love comes with anxiety, where connection is followed by withdrawal, where you monitor the other person's emotional state constantly because their emotional state determines whether you're safe. You've adapted to that environment. Your nervous system has learned its rhythms. And when someone comes along who doesn't create that environment, who is simply, consistently, unspectacularly present, part of you won't initially know what to do with it. Consistency without drama will feel unfamiliar. Someone who texts back without you calculating how long it's been will feel almost strange. Someone who shows up when they say they will, who follows through on small things as naturally as large ones, who doesn't require you to manage their emotional unavailability because they're simply available. This person will feel almost too easy at first. And that feeling that something must be wrong because it doesn't feel like work is worth watching for. Because the relationship you came from taught you that love involves a particular kind of effort. The effort of trying to reach someone who keeps moving. The effort of staying open to someone who keeps closing. The effort of maintaining hope against accumulating evidence that hope is not being honored. Real love doesn't require that effort. Real love requires different effort. The effort of genuine vulnerability, of honest communication, of showing up for someone who is also showing up for you. That effort exists, and its real and healthy relationships require it. But it's categorically different from the effort of loving someone through their defenses. And recognizing the difference, being able to distinguish between the healthy effort of real partnership and the exhausting effort of pursuing someone who keeps retreating, is one of the most important things you'll take from this experience into what comes next. When that person arrives, the avoidance realization about your value will have served its final purpose. It will have been the last piece of accurate information you needed to enter the next relationship without the doubt that was planted by this one. You'll know your value not just because you believe it, but because someone who failed to honor it eventually confirmed it, and someone new is honoring it daily. The confirmation from the past and the honoring in the present will close the loop completely. That's where this ends. Not with them realizing what they lost, with you living in a way that makes their realization irrelevant, because you're too busy being loved correctly to spend time thinking about someone who only learned to see you after they'd already let you go.